You've probably heard that 2019 is the year of Indigenous languages, but did you know that it's also the International Year of the Periodic Table? 150 years ago, that Russian chemist, Dmitri Mendeleev, published the Periodic Table of Chemical Elements in 1869. To mark the anniversary, two artists have created a series of 51 artworks illustrating the birth of the universe through significant elements from that periodic table. The Melbourne-based pair joins me now to talk about the collection, which is launching tomorrow. Damon Kowarsky, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
And Hyun Kim, also thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Now, Damon, starting with you. So this project, it was commissioned by Quantum Victoria, Specialist Science and Maths Centre for primary and secondary students. The centre's director, Sula Bennett, she wanted to marry science and art. How did all that sort of come about?
Well, it came about through good fortune, actually. We met at a gallery opening in Melbourne a couple of years ago, and she said she had this space within her college and she had the idea for an art project but wasn't sure what. And the space was 51 separate hexagonal panels in the foyer of the Science Centre. And I said, well, it's separate objects but they're together, so we need a project that is separate but unified. And it struck me that the periodic table was ideal. I didn't at that stage know that it was coming up to the International Year of the Periodic Table. So it was just this incredibly good coincidence of the architecture, the space, and then 2019 being 150 years.
Yeah. And she also wanted students, young people, young scientists, to see these elements in a different way.
Yes, she very much wanted an artist's take on the periodic table. So someone who was going from outside science and looking in. She felt as an educator that she knew what she expected of the periodic table, but she wanted to very much see what other people would bring to it.
Yeah. Now, Damon, I was so bad at science at school. Just remind me about how many elements there are so far in the periodic table.
There are officially 118. The heaviest one, I think, is organosine, which has only been described in the last couple of years. But of the ones that we interact with on a daily basis, there's maybe, that we'd have around us somehow, there's maybe 80 or 90.
Okay, so how did you decide which ones you were going to illustrate and use?
Well, that was actually decided by the team at Quantum. So it was the first 20, the obvious ones that everyone learnt by heart when you were doing high school chemistry, plus a selection of about 30 others that they felt described significant parts of the periodic table, whether it was because they were elements that were in common use or had an interesting history, or you had Mendeleevium because of Dmitri Mendeleev, Einsteinium with Einstein.
Okay, so you design things in Photoshop?
Yes.
And drawing with architect pens onto drafting film, then you scan them onto the computer and printed them onto watercolour paper, and that's where you come in, Kim. You're the colour expert, the painter.
Yes, I did. So I was looking at so many photographs of color of elements, or how they use for, and sometimes I had to look real eclipse lips, or what else?
We had to unscrew the doorknob from the front door to get a piece of brass.
Oh, okay, great.
So wherever possible, we were using the actual objects and the actual colours. So it was not just about having digital vision. It was about making it as close to reality as possible.
Damon, you managed to squeeze a lot into each one of these hexagon-shaped illustrations. So besides the numbers and symbols, what else did you draw to get the attention of the students? Can you give some examples? For instance, plutonium, I think, something really fascinating with plutonium.
The main image it's called a rapatronic photo. So it's one of those photos taken at millionths of a second, and it's the first atomic explosion. And it's not a mushroom cloud yet. It's just the most peculiar sort of jellyfish object. And then behind that, I put diagrams of the original bomb. But they weren't the diagrams from the Manhattan Project. They were the diagrams that were stolen by Klaus Fuchs and leaked to the Russians. So those diagrams are in Cyrillic, because I wanted to not only talk about the chemistry and the science and the physics, but all the elements are really embedded in history and geopolitics. So it was having lots of different ways into the work.
And Damon, I understand you studied fine art, but you've always been perhaps more interested in applying your drawing skills in practical ways. A scientific illustrator, you've been a courtroom artist, you've even worked out on archaeological digs, drawing for teams in Egypt. So what is your sort of general approach to your art? It seems to be wonderfully adventurous.
Well, I am trained as a fine artist, and in my final year at college, I became aware that I'd been given this education and given all these skills, and it seemed really important that a use be made of them. So I started looking at ways where art is useful as opposed to perhaps decorative or in a gallery. And the three instances you mentioned, scientific, courtroom and archaeological illustration, were places where drawing is required because there is no other way to do it. You can't take a camera into court, so you have to have an artist to draw. And so I investigated these places where drawing still exists as a concrete trade. And even though I've continued with the fine art more, I've always had that interest in where art crosses over and builds bridges out to other areas in the world.
Yeah. Well, Damien and Hyun Kim, thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Damon Kowarsky and Hyun Kim, Melbourne-based artists working across drawing, printmaking and painting. Their project, An Elemental Journey Through the Periodic Table, is launching at Quantum Victoria in Melbourne tomorrow evening. That's the 18th of July. And to see some of their beautifully informative illustrations, do come to our website.